So Ilan was right 10 minutes ago. You're against constitutionalism.
No, I'm against, I am in favor of democracy.
The Democratic Party cannot energize its base based on economic issues. I wish it could.
How can you argue that the Supreme Court is this galvanizing principle for the right because they care that much about abortion, but that for the many, many more Americans who are actually low income, the overwhelming majority of Americans who are struggling with some degree of precarity, they can't be galvanized the same way over financial issues?
There are so many problems that so many Americans are facing that need the government to help. So we are facing a climate crisis that is burning the planet. It's causing more storms. It's going to kill people. Millions, billions of people are going to suffer because of climate change. There is just enormous economic inequality. There's persistent racial inequality caused by factors that the government contributed to, like protecting slavery for generations and the aftermath. And there's a severe lack of democracy. And we could have a perfectly democratic system of government for electing members of Congress. We could eliminate campaign, or we could reform campaign finance issues. We could have proportional representation. We could have a perfect Congress. And the problem posed by the Supreme Court is that every single priority that perfectly democratic Congress could pass is going to get struck down. And so the net effect of the Supreme Court is on the left to limit our political imagination for what is possible. We could have a wealth tax. We could, as Americans, decide that what we need to do is tax the wealthy. And the Supreme Court has like 20 different doctrines that they could take out of their pocket in any given case and strike that down. We could have laws for nationalizing industry, nationalizing the oil industry in order to ensure that we don't keep burning up the planet. I guarantee the Supreme Court would strike that down, or would require compensation, or do all sorts of other things that are just totally discretionary. And so the problem is that the Supreme Court, no matter how democratic Congress becomes, the Supreme Court is just sitting there with this complete discretion to just strike down whatever the left proposes. And so what frustrates me about the Democratic Party is not so much what are they rallying around. It's just that the political imagination is so narrow. It's so tiny. It's like, let's, focus on tax credits, or, just recently, I think the vice president suggested that, perhaps we can get some philanthropies to start spending money to support voting rights. Like if, we can't pass legislation because we can't pass a Voting Rights Act. So we might as well get some billionaires to fund get out the vote effort. And that's a travesty.
Niko, can I ask you a question about this? And I know the answer is going to be, it's a bit of both. But the question is your beef with the Supreme Court or judicial review, judicial review, or with the Constitution itself? And that it just has rules that you think shouldn't apply anymore. So, for example, the wealth tax, to the extent it'll be struck down, it's because it's a direct tax that has to be apportioned among the states according to population, which is tricky to do. It's possible, but it's very tricky to do. That's a pretty antiquated rule. I grant that. But the Constitution says it. And if the Supreme Court strikes down a wealth tax, I think most observers, Dan Hamill in Chicago, who's, not on the right, he's a tax professor, says that it's probably unconstitutional for this reason. I don't think the Supreme Court would be doing something wrong. It would be enforcing the Constitution. Now, it would be enforcing what arguably is a quite antiquated and bad rule. So is your beef here with just the court, or actually just, do you think the Constitution's outdated? And that's the problem.
So I'll give two answers to that. So first, the issue with anything, including a wealth tax, including a Voting Rights Act, it's when Congress and the Supreme Court disagree about what the Constitution requires, who should win? And so there's disagreement about whether the Constitution allows a wealth tax. There's disagreement about whether the Constitution allows a Voting Rights Act. And so I want to live in a democracy. I want to live in a country in which I am a political equal with everybody else. And we, as a community of 340 million people, can decide for ourselves what kind of society we want to live in. And right now we can't. Right now, 339 million of us can decide one thing, but 5 people can say, we think the Constitution means something different, and therefore it does. And that is a severe problem for a democracy. I think as far as the Constitution...
Well, if I can jump in there, though, again, this might go to kind of the unit at which the democracy occurs, because even if a wealth tax is unconstitutional at the national level, I don't think it would be unconstitutional at the state level. Let's say the Affordable Care Act is unconstitutional under the Commerce Clause. I'm not saying that it is.
It's not.
Okay, fine. But Romney Care certainly was constitutional. So you want 390 million Americans to be able to govern themselves. But I think a lot of what the Supreme Court does is it stops Congress from doing things that imposes a uniform rule among the states. And the alternative would be, California can go its way, can have a wealth tax, can have a carbon tax, can do, Romney Care or Newsom Care, whatever it would be in California, and let Texas do something different. And God forbid that there'd be some diversity. So why isn't that like a perfectly reasonable vision of the court's role, keeping Congress in check and letting the states do things?
Yeah, so let's look at the history of the court's relationship to Congress. When the court has said, let's let the states do this, the first time was, we think the states should decide whether slavery should exist. Congress has no role in policing slavery. We think the states should decide whether lynching is punished. We don't need Congress or a federal anti-lynching law to do this. We think the states should decide whether an anti-discrimination law should pass. We shouldn't have a federal anti-discrimination law. We think the states should decide whether there's a wealth tax. We shouldn't have a federal wealth tax. We think the states should decide whether there's a child labor law. We shouldn't have a federal child labor law. We think the states should decide what to do about, you can go on. It's just whenever the Supreme Court says, let's let the states do it, it's to protect the interests of...
Niko, let me ask you a question. And we're generally on the same side, but we do have a slight difference, and it's going to come out in this question. So what do you do tomorrow if Congress passes a law, women can no longer be in the military, no more women or no more blacks in the military, a law by Congress, or in fact, in 1954, if Congress wants segregated schools post-Brown? What happens? Are you going to say to me, well, the answer to Congress won't do that is not a good answer. So my answer is that's a obvious, clear violation when the states do it of the 14th Amendment. I don't see an obvious violation when Congress does it. Maybe there is one. But what do you do with really obviously unconstitutional laws that Congress passes?
So it is a problem in any democracy that the democracy can pass bad legislation. In the United Kingdom, the parliament could pass a law saying no women in the military. That's a problem. The United Kingdom does not have a system of judicial review to prevent that from happening. It has democracy to prevent that from happening. It enfranchises people. It allows everyone. The UK is not a great system of electoral politics. I like the UK as far as the absence of judicial review, and then I think it could do a lot better. The way of protecting political minorities is through the political process. That is the historically successful way to enfranchise and to protect people. And so the Supreme Court...
So Ilan was right 10 minutes ago. You're against constitutionalism.
I'm not against constitutionalism. I think constitutionalism is super important for identifying what our common values are. I would love to have a constitutional convention and decide as a
judicially enforced constitutionalism. You're against that.
I'm against the Supreme Court disagreeing with Congress about what the Constitution requires and declining to enforce federal legislation.
Here's the question. This is what was teed up before, and this is what I was saying earlier about the gap between when Niko said what's constitutional and what's just. They're not it is the fundamental question is, as a nation, as a global community, we have to decide what the rights and interests of competing groups are all the time. And we have a system that creates certain kinds of checks and balances, but which is imperfect. And any other kind of system is going to be imperfect. And we keep defaulting to the mean because no one wants to be responsible. It's like a trolley problem. Nobody wants to be responsible for creating new vulnerabilities. We'll just stick with the old vulnerabilities. But I think part of what Niko really lays out in his written remarks at the commission was that while we have this internalized view of the Supreme Court protecting a marginalized minority in this country against mob rule, and very often cases like Brown v. Board are pointed to as examples of that, the real story of the Supreme Court is one of real caprice mixed with bad action, being bad actors.
I wrote a whole book on that. I spent 300 pages demonstrating what you just said is obviously true.
Right.
But I want to say, I want to finish. Yeah.
Go ahead.
But we could still have judicial review in the way that appellate judges look at factual findings of lower courts. So for your non-lawyer listeners, when a federal trial court makes a finding of fact, the Court of Appeals is only supposed to reverse that if it was clearly erroneous. Clearly erroneous. And that's really hard to show. And my experience prior to Trump judges is that 95% of federal judges take that charge seriously. Even if they disagree with the lower court, they won't change the factual findings unless they're clearly erroneous. I don't understand, Niko, why you're against a similar system for judicial review, where it is obviously and clearly and demonstrably in error. Judges should step in, but that's the burden of proof. It's very high. Judges understand burdens of proof. They understand presumptions. And then we can't have a 33-year-old president. That's settled. It's 35. But what free speech means is reasonably debatable most of the time. And I agree with you. Congress has as much authority to say what free speech means as does the Supreme Court. What Congress doesn't have the authority to do is authorize a 33-year-old president. Why isn't that the answer?
So there's two responses. So one is that the hypothetical is always imagine like this clearly erroneous law that no one could ever think is constitutional. And in order to sort of get to the point where the Supreme Court is deciding whether a federal law is clearly erroneous, like majorities of Congress and the president have passed that law. There is at least some debate about what the Constitution tolerates, because some people passed the statute. Some people thought a wealth tax was constitutional, or at least an income tax was constitutional. And the Supreme Court disagreed on the grounds of clear error. So one problem with having like a clear error standard, so say that the Supreme Court can strike down federal laws whenever they're clearly erroneous, is who knows what clear error really means? It's just a question of discretion. And it's really difficult to say that Congress, and majorities of Congress have passed a law that clearly violated the Constitution, and that the Supreme Court can determine which laws are clearly erroneous and which are not. But I think that the more broad, this is something that Brianna mentioned that many of the people at the commission spoke about, is we also just have this inalterable Constitution. And that itself is a really broad source of anti-democracy. And so one example is in 1861, so right before the Civil War started, Congress passed a constitutional amendment. Abraham Lincoln supported it. It would have been a 13th Amendment. And the amendment was, no future amendment will ever allow Congress effectively to abolish slavery. So it was Congress, no amendment shall allow Congress to regulate domestic institutions. I think like 6 or 7 states, including like Illinois, ratified it, but not enough. It's still out there. If the states wanted to ratify it, they still could. It's a real problem. But so you can imagine that as part of the Constitution. Like it's not difficult to imagine that enough states ratified that. And so just imagine that we lived in 2021, and as part of our Constitution, it said that Congress can't eliminate slavery, and that Congress cannot regulate domestic institutions, and no amendment can get rid of it. It's an inalterable problem. Like that's a severe problem for a democracy, to have within it this completely unjust, inalterable provision that would protect slavery.
But that just means Ilan was right. You're against judicially enforceable constitutionalism.
No, I'm against. I am in favor of democracy, and I think that democracy should decide what kinds of constitution we want to live under.
Let's unpack this a little bit, Eric, because again, the point I'm trying to get to is when Niko raises the examples of other countries, I think I'm really trying to figure out where the layperson is going to be coming to this, because by not following through what the consequences would be, I think it keeps it really vague. So the reality is, in one of these examples where some terrible law gets passed and there's no constitution to strike it down, first and foremost, I would argue that historically it's good laws being passed and the Supreme Court striking those down, and much less frequently in the other direction.
Agreed.
But let's pretend like this has happened. What we're talking about is what recourse could be levied in response is democratic. Presumably, we understand that there's the Senate is anti-democratic. We don't have a direct democracy. All of those problems need to be addressed as well. But we would presume that if people really didn't like this thing, that they would vote out the Congress that passed this horrible law. And in fact, the existence of the Supreme Court acting as this kind of undemocratic lever in this case sometimes offers protection for members of both parties and different political actors who can kind of hide behind results and not have to stand behind what political outcomes are because ultimately their hands are clean. And
that was the thesis of my book. Why are you trying to persuade me? That's the thesis of my book and 30 years of work. I agree. The only narrow difference we have here, and it's very, first of all, I'd be happy to abolish judicial review. All I'm saying is in our country, we have this very old constitution that has some very clear things in it that structure some of the ways we run ourselves. If those things are unenforceable in court, I'm okay with that. But I suspect Ilan's going to say, what's the point of putting them in a constitution if they're completely and totally unenforceable, other than by people voting it out? Because the Constitution is supposed to put some things beyond the pale of voters. That's the whole point of...
No, but it's not supposed to put it beyond the pale of voters. And Ilan mentioned an example that I think is really good. So the generation that ratified the Constitution, first thing they do in a decade is pass these laws that allow Congress to deport immigrants and that ban certain criticism of the federal government, the Alien and Sedition Acts. Those laws were not challenged they were challenged in federal court. The federal courts did not strike them down. What got rid of the alien law was democratic politics. It was the Democratic Republicans saying, this violates our constitutional traditions. We should not have laws like this. You should elect us so that we'll get rid of these laws. And that's what got rid of the Alien Act. The Sedition Act just sat there until the 20th century when the Wilson administration started using it, and the Supreme Court said, yup, it's good. So I think as far as judicial review is concerned, we cannot rely on courts to determine which laws are good and bad. We have to rely on ourselves.
I agree.
And Niko, on that point, by the way, that's sort of the easy departmentalist case, because when the Supreme Court upholds a law, a really bad law, nothing prevents a future Congress, as in the case of the Alien Sedition Acts, from repealing it. I think the sedition law expired in 1801, and then Jefferson, nothing prevents him from pardoning offenders against the law using his power. Nothing prevents Jackson from vetoing the bank, even though the Supreme Court upheld it. The much trickier question is what happens when the Supreme Court says something is unconstitutional and you think that's really wrong. And that's kind of where the rubber meets the road. That's the Dred Scott case, Shelby County, RFRA.
Yeah, I totally agree. And that's the thing. So when the Supreme Court says we're not going to strike down this federal law, you can still do a lot of things to stop the federal law. That's absolutely true. But the real problem is that there is an asymmetry when the Supreme Court declines to enforce the federal law, because then what Congress has to do is, if it wants its law enforced, it has to propose a constitutional amendment, and that is impossible.
So, Niko, what should the court have done with Congress's decision to segregate the public schools of Washington, D.C.?
Congress did not make a decision about that. D.C. did.
Well, no, it's ultimately Congress's decision.
But Congress, there was no statute at issue in...
All right. Had there been a statute in Bowling that said by Congress that D.C. schools must be segregated?
We can imagine, what if Congress legalized slavery? What if Congress put me and sent me to the moon?
Except the schools were segregated in 1953. It's not a hypothetical.
Yeah, the schools were segregated because the Supreme Court struck down Congress's anti-discrimination law.
We're all everything you said about history and the courts in the states is right. There are counterexamples.
The problem with the hypotheticals is it's like we only live in America. We only see America, as though I cannot see that New Zealand, the United Kingdom, Netherlands, like all these other democracies that otherwise we think are great, manage to function without judicial review.
Well, don't accuse me of that. Don't accuse me of that, because that's not where I sit.
I do think this is an important point. I want us to, we've gone for about an hour. I don't know if you guys have hard outs, but I did want to ask you about some of these specific kinds of court reforms before I let you go. Hey, YouTube, don't forget this is a podcast. To get full episodes, including ones that are behind a paywall, go to patreon.com/badfaithpodcast. To get more episodes, please do subscribe to this channel, hit the notification bell, and like this video.